You've probably heard this thing called church hurt, church trauma, people leaving the church because something has happened. It's something that us as a community, as part of the body of Christ, it's something that we don't want to talk about with people outside of the church. And unfortunately, it's also something that we are not really willing to talk about within the walls of the church. And because of that, the hurt continues. Because of that, the trauma continues. And Noe, we had a conversation where there's hope amidst some of the pain.
And the hope is there, but sometimes the way to hope, excuse me, is through the pain. And like Psalm 23 says, we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And trauma is it's a valley. And the church has a lot of hurt. And it's okay to recognize it. And in fact, if we do, and we give it the space and the time, we might actually find ourselves as a whole church body actually reaching the other side of healing, but doing it together and doing it hand in hand versus separating and disunifying, which that leads to probably even more hurt. So, and the trauma can happen in all kinds of ways, internally from external sources. It could be spiritual abuse from within the church. It could be all forms of dysfunction. It could be a natural disaster that happened. It could be a political situation. So, but we've got to go through it to get to the other side.
So we're going to be talking about that. We have Kayleigh Clark from Restor, and we'll be talking with her in this conversation. If you know somebody who's gone through it, who's experienced it, and maybe still recovering from it, this would be a great episode to lean in on here on the Life After Ministry podcast. Hey, Kayleigh Clark, welcome to the Life After Ministry podcast. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and special guest with us also, Noe Rivera, who's up early on the West Coast. Thanks for getting up this morning, buddy.
Up with the birds. It feels good.
We used to say we woke up the rooster when you get up that early, so it's good to have you. Noe, you came back from a conference a couple weeks ago, and you let us know that you met Kayleigh. Give us a little bit of the background of the conference and the conversation that you had with her, and why are we doing this? Why are we having this conversation right now?
It was actually really wonderful to meet Kayleigh there. And so at the Common Table Conference, we were able to gather as a group, around 100, 150 people out at Biola in Southern California. And it's actually a really wonderful conference of people that are really interested in the intersection of psychology and the Christian community and clergy. And so really intersecting those areas and the mental health, and specifically mental health for ministry leaders and the impact on churches and congregations. And the speakers were great. The conversations were great. And the way they set up this conference is more intimate, where you do a lot of roundtables and a lot of discussions together versus just sitting in the room and only listening to a main speaker. And so Kayleigh, it was really great to sit next to her actually and really understand her work of what she's doing in her role. And every time she would speak and give some input in our roundtable, so we were part of the same roundtable discussing forced terminations and toxic congregations. And so it's kind of a big topic. And so whenever she would talk, I'm like, oh, she really understands this topic. Like, she gets toxic congregations and forced terminations. And I'm like, I just have to learn more from her. I feel like there's just a lot coming from her that, and we'll get more into kind of who she is and obviously what she offers in this realm. But I was like, I have to learn more and I have to understand what's going on. And then I was feeling, because I want to learn more, I'm like, other people should know about what she's saying and what she's learning about just the challenges that are facing the church, especially when it comes to trauma and the impact on the collective church. And so I was like, we got to get her on the podcast. We have to talk and have the broader audience hear what she has to say.
Yeah, it's amazing that number one, we even have to have conferences and conversations like this for the church. And then I'd also say, thank God there are conversations that are happening like this for the church. I think it's needed, and I think we've even seen just in the couple years that pastoral transitions has been around, we're starting to see a little bit of a groundswell of a little bit more paying attention as we see the dysfunction, as we see the hurt, the trauma that takes place in the church. So, Kayleigh, how did you get started in really pursuing this and being part of this conversation?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of one of those things, right? Where I just said I really understand toxic congregations, and that's always a question: how does one come to really understand toxic congregations? And for me, it's a both and. It's both the research that I've done, but also the life that I have lived. And so I am fourth generation clergy. And so I come from a long line of pastors and people who love Jesus and love his church. And quite frankly, I've always been most at home amongst pastors and within the church. But when you grow up in the parsonage, you quickly realize that the church is not immune to the suffering of the world, and that trauma happens both within the church and outside of it.
Mm.
And so, we were part of several pastoral transitions. I went to 3 different high schools in 4 years, so we moved a lot. So we were parts of lots of pastoral transitions, some done well, some done not so well, and got to kind of witness some of that firsthand. But still felt called by God to become a pastor myself. And so entered into ministry. And I'm often asked if I became a pastor because I was a pastor's kid or in spite of being a pastor's kid. And I always say yes. It's a little bit of both. And the reason being, the church has always been, for me, my second home. It's my family. And I've always seen how beautiful it is, and how when it's being what God has called it to be, what God has created it to be, it is the one organization, the one community, the one family on this planet that can bring hope and healing and wholeness when it's being what God has called it to be. But I've also seen how it can be a place of great harm. And so it's both for me, it's holding that tension in that middle place of needing to name the pain and the suffering, but holding on to the hope of what the church can be. That really, kept me in ministry. And so then I, became a pastor myself and entered the world of ministry and got my first staff pastor job, not working for my dad. And so working for my dad was wonderful and great. And then I stepped out into the big world of ministry, and I became a family ministries pastor and just worked for a lead pastor who just really led in some very harmful ways, and got to see kind of, toxic congregation from that side of things. What does it look like to be on staff and work in a staff that just doesn't have, healthy leadership in it? And how do you carry that? And how do you work through that? I left that ministry position to take my first lead pastorate job. And in my first lead pastorate, I encountered a congregation that was suffering. It was one of those congregations that would have been labeled, in decline, in need of revitalization. It was aging, all of those things. And the kind of idea was, if we put this new young pastor in here, right, like that'll turn everything around and that'll fix everything. And I read all the books about how to cast vision and write a mission statement. And these were the books that were available to me as a new pastor for what to do with this dying church. And I quickly found that those things did not work. And I am a type A student person. I do my homework, and it was like I was doing my homework and it wasn't working, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I started to realize that this church had been through many difficult pastoral transitions before I had gotten there, with lots of, secrecy and deception and manipulation and all those things that had just kind of built up. And I didn't know what to do with it, and I wasn't equipped to know how to address those things. And so, being the very type A student person that I am, I decided I would go back to school to figure this out. And so that's how I found myself in a doctoral program, which was a THD program that combines the psychological study of trauma theory with theological studies. And quickly in that program, God drew my heart and my attention to the study of collective trauma. And I felt like for the first time, he was giving me language for things that I had experienced in the church, things I had seen in the church, but things that we were not equipped to deal with in the church and things we didn't have language for in the church. And it was as though all of the problems that we had been diagnosing as revitalization problems or decline problems were really becoming trauma problems. And I felt like I had a new diagnosis for the pain that I was seeing within the church, and perhaps maybe now a new path towards healing. So that's how I got here.
It's interesting because you have to start with the assumption that God is a God who wants to heal. He is the God who heals. And if he is a God who heals, that we also have to make the same assumption that there's brokenness and there's hurt. And this idea of church hurt, we think that church hurt only exists with people who are in the church as participants, the congregants, but we're also seeing this in leadership. And I remember my wife and I going through a season in marriage where we were struggling and not doing well. And, when you're hurt in the church, it's easier to just leave. Either you're going to go find another church or you're going to just leave the church. And, we had a season where we were not sure we were going to stay in the marriage. And it was a little bit of the same thing of, well, maybe we just need to leave the marriage. And obviously that's a story that plays out for a lot of people, a lot of couples. But we had a counselor who stopped us in our tracks and he said, what if God wants to actually bring healing for you? He says the best and most perfect healing is within the container of your marriage. And I'm just curious what that looks like for you to be able to see, what does healing of church hurt, of this trauma, look like within the container of the church, the actual body that brought the hurt in the beginning? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I am so thankful that you asked that question, because this is a huge passion of mine. And that if we are going to see healing from church hurt, it has to happen within the church. And so I am part of a lot of conversations around church hurt and church trauma. And there is a lot of work being done around religious trauma is becoming like a study in and of itself. And so is spiritual abuse. And there's all of these conversations happening. And so many of them are happening outside of the church. And the predominant voices in these conversations are from outside of the church. And I'm thankful for that research and I'm thankful for that conversation. But I am convicted and stand in this conviction that if the healing is going to come, it has to happen in the church. Now, sometimes for individuals who experienced real spiritual abuse and real religious trauma, they need a season away from the church. And they need, I'm not saying this replaces counseling or any of that. Those are all super important and valuable. But if it's going to end, if religious trauma is going to end, if church hurt is going to end, if we don't want to get to a place where we don't have to have these conversations anymore, then that change has to happen in the church. And that involves pastors and church leaders discovering God's heart for what it means to bring healing. And there's this really powerful passage in scripture that I go to all of the time that's in Jeremiah 23. And it's this section where I believe that God, he's calling out church hurt in the Old Testament. And he's calling out these religious leaders and he's telling them, you haven't shepherded my people. And you've let them wander and you've harmed them and you've only looked out for yourself, right? He's calling out the harmful religious leaders. But what's powerful to me about this passage is God's solution. And so God's solution to this problem is I am going to raise up new shepherds. In other words, God's solution is not to come up with a new system or a new organization. No, he's just going to raise up new shepherds who are going to shepherd in the way that he's called them to. And I really believe that that's the answer to this church hurt, is that when people who love Jesus are going to choose to be his body and his bride in the way that he's called us to, that's where the healing's actually going to come. And we can't wait for it to just happen outside of the church. It has to happen inside of the church. And that's the only way we're going to see true healing, because the healing that God wants to bring is this radiant bride that he describes in Ephesians. He wants to see his radiant bride. And so I am committed to working for that radiant bride in whatever way that I can.
And Kayleigh, as you're talking, I can almost hear that the passion come out, and how in the beginning you were saying for you, you hold both. You have your educational experience, you have your work experience, being a pastor, and then for you it's not just the academic part, it's also your lived experience, and I hear that coming through. And so I guess my wondering with that is, for you, what have you seen, because you've been through this yourself? So what have you seen as helpful things, helpful conversations, helpful even through your research, things that are moving this forward towards its progress, to begin the conversation? Because it sounds like the conversation is just even beginning in these years of, wait a minute, hold on, the church is hurting, and we have to give credence to it. We've got to give a voice to it. And so what are you seeing is being helpful to even begin this conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it is new, right? It's a new conversation, especially when we talk about it from a collective standpoint. And so collective trauma is a new vein of study, even in secular psychology. Well, it's newer than individual trauma, which has been researched for a lot longer. And so collective trauma is a newer branch of study in psychology and counseling. It's gaining quite the popularity, especially with COVID, which was kind of a universal collective trauma, right? Yeah. And so there's a lot more conversation happening around it right now. But that means that it's really new within the church. And especially when we look at even the study of religious trauma focuses specifically on the impact on the individual. And so individuals who have walked through religious trauma or spiritual abuse, and it's missing this collective component, this collective aspect of the conversation, which I do believe is really important, that entire congregations will feel the pain and feel the suffering, and sometimes experience collective trauma as a whole. And so what I'm finding is helpful is both, it starts with being able to give language to these things. Because these things have been happening, but people don't know what to call them. And they haven't ever been told that perhaps collective trauma could be what is, guiding them, forming them, shaping their behaviors. I think a really good place to start that I've found really helpful is a reframing of what we're calling toxic congregation or toxic congregations or harmful congregations. I think the starting place often when we approach congregations who are in decline or who have behaviors that are harmful has always been to ask, what are you doing or what's wrong with you? And so that's where we get things like, these lists of things that deceased churches have, right? Or these things that lead to declining churches. For me, a better starting point question is always what has happened to you. And I believe that if we start there, and if we approach congregations and we approach, ministries with the question of what has happened to you, and this posture of curiosity that says, compassionate curiosity, a posture of compassionate curiosity that comes to these congregations, and instead of seeing them as the problem, and instead of seeing them as what is causing harm just because they're harmful people, if we can step back and say, well, what has happened to you? And maybe we get to start unpacking why they have great distrust for anybody that wears the pastoral title, right? Maybe we can start unpacking why any suggestion of change, whether it be something as simple as, changing the paint color of the sanctuary to something as dramatic as getting rid of pews, which we know that can cause upheaval, right? But if we can start asking, well, why, and start looking back at maybe things that happened to the congregation, maybe ways that change was not led well before, maybe ways that pastors misused their authority before, and we can start to kind of unpack those things. Then instead of it becoming this almost us versus them mentality, right? Where it's, the pastor or the leadership against the congregation trying to get on one page. It can become this, working together for greater healing and wholeness, and understanding one another's stories in a way that leads us to greater health and unity and clarity. And so that would be where I would start.
Mm.
How much of this is, I mean, is this, I know it's a problem in pockets. And we, if I worked at a hospital, all I would see is sick people, and my purview for, like, wow, the world is really sick. But, and so we see this, and we get, calls from pastors all the time and constantly in those conversations of there's brokenness in the church. But for those of us who are operating in this space all the time, it feels like, man, this is rampant on a global scale. And I'm not even talking like worldwide, but like maybe just here in the States. But like, how big of a problem is this? Are we making a bigger problem of this than we should, or is this actually a real problem? And one of the things that Noe told me after he talked to you is he says she knows a lot of stats. So I'm even just curious of, like, what are some of those numbers that maybe contextualize the vastness of this problem, or maybe it's not all that vast?
Sure. Well, I will say, unfortunately, there are not a lot of stats yet on congregational trauma as a
Mm.
whole, right? Because this is still very new. And in fact, a lot of the research that's been done around congregational trauma deals more with what I would call kind of external trauma. So when a congregation experiences, like a school shooting in their community, and what does that trauma look like for the church to process? Or when there's a
Mm.
natural disaster around the church, that's where a lot of the research has been done. And so there's less research done on trauma kind of within the church, as far as, and specifically when we're looking at, you know, the difficult, the really sticky ones like the clergy misconduct and those kind of things. Now that is increasing in research, mostly because of the secular media who keeps, calling it out, right? So we're getting a lot more
Mm.
stories about these things and realizing, okay, we need to deal with them ourselves. But what I will say there are more numbers on is more the prevalence of kind of individual religious trauma and individual spiritual abuse. And so those numbers are quite devastating, honestly. There are things like, I think it's 1 in 4 people have experienced some kind of spiritual abuse. Like, it's a high number. Now, if you take that number and you think, okay, well, now apply that to a congregation, now you have a high number of people within a congregation who feel as though they've experienced some kind of spiritual abuse or religious trauma. And where does that come from, right? So that religious trauma and spiritual abuse come from places where, spiritual abuse specifically comes from places where religious power is misused to harm individuals, right? And so then that kind of opens your eyes to some of this is more widespread than we would like to think it is. Then when you take just stats on trauma in itself, right? Like, 75% of people, and this is worldwide, have experienced some form of trauma. And then you apply that to congregations and you think, okay, 75% of my congregation has probably experienced some form of trauma. Well, how many of your pastors are actually trauma informed? How many people who are in charge of handling pastoral transitions are trauma informed in such a way that they can do those things without increasing trauma for
Mm.
people?
Right.
And so
Can
that's
you
where I think we get
can you
more of that.
actually, I know I'm hanging out with the psychologist this morning, but what does that mean for a pastor to be trauma informed? What
Yeah.
extra is this training, or is this just an
Mhm.
awareness? Like, help me understand
Mhm.
that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I would say it requires some training, right? I don't think every pastor is going to go out and get like a psychology degree, but it requires some form of training that gives you a baseline understanding of trauma so that you can make decisions based on your understanding of trauma that move towards restoration instead of moving towards more harm. And
Right.
so it's simple things sometimes, like even just being able to approach scripture and realize, oh, this passage of scripture has some I mean, there's a lot of passages of scripture that have some trauma in them, right? And so it's being able to look at that and go, okay, so how am I going to preach this text in a way that honors the suffering of the people in the pews and honors the suffering on the page, but doesn't put somebody into kind of like a spiraling. And so you see things that can be simply done are just, even trigger, what are called trigger warnings. And so, oftentimes if there's because I go to all these conferences and talks and stuff that are mostly on trauma, they'll often begin with, we're going to be talking about trauma. If this is too heavy for you, please feel free to step outside. Please feel free to take a breath. Or even, and I've done this when I've led trainings on trauma for pastors, we'll stop because I realize I'm giving them a lot of heavy information because we do a lot of talk about abuse. And so I'll pause in between my trainings and we'll just take deep breaths together before I keep going. And so it's this awareness of what's happening within people's bodies based on trauma responses that then informs our practices so that we shepherd in a way that will move people towards greater healing instead of causing them to spiral into more hurt.
Yeah, and that lens of trauma, like you were saying a little earlier, it just really strikes me how I think for an individual basis, we are doing well, I'd say, just from my understanding of the church as a whole, but also how the mental health is a lot more, quote unquote, like allowed within the church realm. And not only just allowed for individuals, but I think I've really seen moving forward of that mental health services and acknowledgement of mental health, emotional health is okay, even for clergy and for ministry leaders. And so now what I think I'm hearing you say is, hey, we also need to take the same perspective as the collective whole of the church and with a trauma-informed lens, which can really, I think what I'm hearing too is it helps slow you down. It helps slow someone down of, hey, we're not just looking at the surface level issue and the topic, but there's a mountain or a molehill underneath that perhaps is why the things on the surface is happening. And what if we come at this at a, like you said, a compassionate care and understanding, and not to dismiss the surface pain, not to dismiss and to not hold things accountable. But if we want to stop the cycles, it somewhat actually reminds me of in my services that I do in counseling is people come into counseling individually with a lot of surface hard stuff that either they're really walking through anger or sadness and it's impacting their life. They're in addictions, or they are, wanting to harm themselves, or it's a lot of surface issues. And in psychology and mental health, and I'm a MFT, a marriage and family therapist, but we're obviously trained in is not to come in and just fix their issue. We're trained to listen to their history and ask, how did this happen? What is going on for you that this even became a thing? Because if you could understand the roots, then you can actually help change the fruit. And I think what I'm hearing is you're saying, hey, let's actually come into congregations. Let's understand and ask maybe the congregation as a whole, almost like a counselor for a congregation, and ask, hey guys, there's a lot of surface things happening here. So what are the roots here? And let's have a compassionate understanding and a care that the trauma isn't necessarily, no one necessarily desired for it to happen, but it's happening. And underneath, there's a lot of residual just pain and the threads of pain happening in this congregation, and asking the whole as a congregation. So it just gets my mind rolling to different ideas of how we could solve of like, maybe we need to have a lot more roundtables with churches and a lot more town hall events for churches themselves, and say, hey guys, you guys went through a huge transition. Let's talk about it. Let's breathe. Let's soak this in. Let's really understand this in a healthy, compassionate way to have hard conversations, but do this within the context of the church, like you're saying, and receive healing within the context of the church. So don't have a question with that. I just have this, I really understand that what you're saying can be powerful of how to approach this different within the church. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Kayleigh, what does it look like then? You're not just talking about it and attending conferences and doing workshops, but you have a ministry. Tell us about the ministry, and I want you to share the name and how you came up with that name. But what does some of that look like as you're uh, trying to be a force of you get to be a carrier of, as we kind of talked about in the beginning, that God is a God who heals, and we are. He's looking for partners in His work here on earth, right? So, what does that look like as you're carrying that light and that torch into some of these places of brokenness?
Yeah, thank you. So I started Restory, which is a nonprofit that started about a year and a half ago in June. And so yeah, Restory is the name of it, and it comes from my doctoral studies. So when I was reading and studying trauma theory, they would use this word of Restory to describe what they were inviting clients to do in their trauma healing process. But when I read the word, I immediately thought that sounds like a very church word. It sounds like a Jesus word. That sounds like what our God does, is that he's the author of our story, and he's constantly helping us restory it. And one of the key missions of Restory is to act kind of as a bridge between the psychology research world and the church world. And what I consider, the way that I approach my research, is that I'm always trying to kind of translate these psychological concepts into language that makes sense to pastors and clergy so that they can implement it and they can use it and they can learn from it and they can recognize it within their own congregations. And so I thought, well, let's take this psychological word that I think will resonate really well with clergy, and let's use that to help build this bridge. And let's also use it to help capture the imagination of what we believe God is doing within the church. That we truly believe that trauma does not have to write the church's story, that a new story is possible, and that God is in this process of helping us discover what that might be. Because it is a discovery process. It is this journey of unpacking, okay, trauma has caused your story to be XYZ, but what is God actually at work doing so that your story can now be something beautiful and part of God's restorative mission for the world? And so that's who we are. What we do is kind of varied. So we offer resources, training, and consulting for churches and pastors and church leaders. And so we set out, to be fully honest, we set out to be primarily a consulting ministry where we wanted to come alongside churches and journey with them in kind of a 1 to 2 year process of healing from collective trauma. And we still greatly, desire to do that. But what we realized was that people didn't have the language for it. And so we quickly entered into more of a season of training. And so right now, what we primarily do is we primarily train pastors, church leaders, denominational leaders in recognizing and understanding congregational trauma, recognizing and understanding religious trauma, spiritual abuse. And then we also do a lot of training around secondary traumatic stress in clergy and how you can properly care for clergy themselves and for denominational leaders and others who are kind of in charge of caring for clergy. And so right now, a lot of our ministry is focused on that training aspect. And then we also provide different resources for churches and pastors to use, both kind of personally. And a lot of our resources are designed to help pastors weave restoration into everything that they do. And so I'm a big proponent of saying, like, look, just to be a trauma-informed church doesn't mean you have to overhaul everything. I can guarantee that you could look right now at your weekly worship service flow and identify a few key places that you could just add in some restoration language, that you could just add in some tools of lament, some naming of suffering, some different things that you could easily weave in. And so a lot of the resources that we offer are not to help people kind of overthrow everything they've been doing, but recognize where they can just weave restoration into the liturgy of their church already. And so those are kind of the three main things that we do. We do the consulting, which can either be congregational wide, or we'll do clergy coaching. And so if a clergy person finds themselves walking through a really difficult situation with a church and they don't quite know how to navigate it, we can come in and do some clergy coaching. We can do whole congregation partnerships where we do some of what Noe was saying, where we actually we do these timeline exercises with churches that are beautiful and often so enlightening, when we help churches kind of sketch out the timeline of their church story, and we identify places of great joy and these moments of celebration, and then we go back through and we identify some moments of great pain and suffering, and we see the ways in which they all intermingle, and then we are able to walk the church through a process of identifying when those painful suffering moments happened. The moment ended, but we carried this thing with us, and it's still informing our values and our behaviors. And so we do that with churches. And I tell churches that's going to take us a year at least, because for a congregation to come to a deep awareness of maybe the trauma that they're carrying takes a really long time. And then we don't want to just leave them in a place of awareness, but we want to bring them to a place of great hope and a place where they can imagine a new future. And so then we spend the rest of our time going, okay, who is God going to ask us to be? Who do we want to be? And how do we move forward into this new imagination and this new story? So that's what our kind of congregational partnerships look like. But like I said, right now we're trying to help give people language. And so we're doing a lot of training for pastors and churches and denominational leaders.
Kayleigh, I love it. I think sometimes what we think is that healing, it's never as quick as we want it to be. I remember my friend who, when he went away to college, he would come home on the summers, and there was always projects around the house that his parents wanted to do. And there was a summer where he came home, and the question was, do they paint the back deck another coat of paint and try to make this old deck look like it was going to be okay? And as they started to look at it, they just saw the rot from the inside over the years, because it was just old, right? The wood wasn't lasting. And so they had the two options that they had were throw another coat of paint on and see if it lasts another year, or do we actually take down the whole thing? In a sense, we have to get some new lumber in, and we have to set some new footings, and we have to build something new that's going to actually hold and last. And really, anytime you take a step on it, you know it's going to hold you, and you're not going to have your foot fall through, right? Because nobody wants that. And I think that the work of restoration, the work of restory, the work of trying to bring the bride into, we know the end of the story, that there will be a time in Revelation 22, it says, they will see his face. The bride sees the face of the groom, Jesus, and his face is not one of disappointment. It's awesome. So from now until that day, we have work to do. And really that the work of healing and health and wholeness is work. So we thank you for the work that you're doing. If we want to get in touch with Kayleigh and the work that she's doing at Restor, you can find on her website, restorycenter.com. And we'll put that link in the notes if you're listening. But Kayleigh, we're blessed. I'm so glad that Noe has met you and brought you in, and now you're stuck with us. So welcome to the family here at Pastoral Transitions. We love it. You're our people. So thanks for being here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, this has been an honor.
Kayleigh.
Thank you.
Hey, we're so thankful for the conversation with Kayleigh Clark. If you want to know more about the work that she's doing, you can go again to restorycenter.com and connect with what she's doing. And if you just need space to have a confidential conversation, if you're in the midst of it, you might be a pastor on staff, you might be a person in a church that maybe feels a bit toxic, dysfunctional, you see the trauma, there's triggers all over the place. We'd love to have a conversation and be able to point you towards what healing might look like. And believe it or not, a lot of the work that we do at Pastoral Transitions, we're working with pastors who are hurt. We're working with pastors who are in the midst of their own life circumstances, trying to keep their head above water themselves. They're dealing with difficulties with difficult people, situations within their own families, and they need help. And we just want you to be encouraged that there is healing that's taking place. And there are many of you who are giving towards this effort. A lot of the folks that are coming to us are coming without the funds necessary to be able to get the help that they need. We would love to be able to give everything away for free. We never turn anyone away, but there's also a limitation because of finances. If you feel compelled to be able to help pastors who are in transition, If you have a heart for helping pastors who want to stay in church, but they just need the help to be able to get firmed up, to get that healing, go to our website, pastoraltransitions.com. There's a button there that says donate, whether that's from your church and you want to be able to support and partner with us in the work that we're doing, you individually, whatever that might look like, we take that, we put it to use, and we are helping to bring that healing for the church, for the kingdom, to be able to be a light to the world.